She was just a girl with no voice and no one to protect her, until an old, broken-down stallion stepped between her and the cruelty that threatened to crush her spirit. In that single moment, everything changed. What began as a simple act of defiance grew into a lifelong legacy of healing, love, and fierce courage. This is the story of a horse who refused to give up on a girl who had already given up on herself, and how together they built a world where no one would ever have to stand alone again. It was just past sunrise when Maribelle crept barefoot through the dewy grass, her threadbare cardigan pulled tight around her bony frame. The barn sat in the distance, quiet and stoic, like an old friend waiting patiently. She glanced over her shoulder. No one stirred in the house yet. That gave her maybe an hour, 2 if she was lucky, long enough to disappear into the comforting smells of hay, oats, and warm animals, where no one screamed her name in anger. Her feet barely made a sound against the worn wooden boards as she slipped inside. The air was still, hushed but full of soft life. Chickens clucked sleepily from their roosts. The goats were already awake, nosing around for breakfast. But she didn't come for them. She came for him. "Morning, old man," she whispered, threading her way to the back stall. The stallion stood tall and still, his silver mane trailing like cobwebs down his thick neck. He was ancient, a creature of strength long since dulled by time, but not erased. His eyes, dark and deep, tracked her every movement with quiet understanding. "Hey, Dusty," she breathed, reaching a hand over the stall door. The old stallion took a slow step forward and nuzzled her palm, warm breath fanning across her skin. He was the only thing in the world that didn't make her feel like a burden. "You sleep okay?" she asked, her voice cracking from the cold and more than a little sadness. Dusty snorted softly, shifting his weight like he was shrugging off the night's chill. Maribelle smiled for the first time that morning. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a withered apple she'd hidden from last night's dinner. Her stepmother would have slapped her silly if she knew, but Maribelle didn't care. Not anymore. The stallion chomped down gently, his teeth yellow and gapped, but still eager. She rubbed his soft muzzle, burying her face against his cheek. "I wish I could stay here forever." She didn't notice the silence in the barn break, the soft creak of a door, the crunch of boots on straw, not until the voice rang out, sharp and cruel. "Thieving again, huh?" Maribel's spine straightened like a board. She turned slowly, dread crawling up her neck. Her stepmother, Jolene, stood just inside the barn, arms folded tight, lips curled into a sneer. Her eyes flicked from the half-eaten apple to Maribel's hand on the horse. "I ought to make you eat what's left of that core." He was hungry," Maribelle stammered, stepping protectively in front of Dusty's stall. Jolene marched forward, eyes wild. "That's not your apple to give, you useless brat, and that ain't your horse either." "He's not hurting anyone," Maribelle tried. Smack. Jolene's hand cracked across her cheek, not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to make her eyes water and her pride shrivel. "You don't talk back to me," the woman hissed. "Not in my barn." Maribelle stared at the floor, blinking fast. Her cheek throbbed. She could taste the tang of blood on her tongue. "Go on," Jolene snapped. "Get out of here before I make you muck every stall with your bare hands." Dusty let out a low, warning whinny. Maribelle turned back and pressed a calming hand to his neck. "It's okay," she whispered to him, even though it wasn't. Not really. But she left. Not because she wanted to, but because the only thing worse than staying was giving Jolene an excuse to do worse. Later that day, the sun climbed higher and the house groaned with heat. Her stepbrother, Clyde, sprawled across the couch in a stained tank top, half a bag of chips on his chest. He didn't acknowledge her as she passed through the living room. "Where you think you're going?" he muttered, eyes not leaving the TV. "Just getting water," she replied. "Better not be sneaking off again." "I'm not." "You got that look on your face," he said without looking. "That I'm about to run away and cry to the horses look." She bit the inside of her cheek hard. Clyde had been cruel in quiet ways, not like Jolene, who was loud and spiteful. Clyde was worse because his cruelty slithered in slow, like the time he'd locked her outside in the freezing rain just to teach her a lesson. Or when he'd stolen the birthday card she got from her mother's sister, the only family she had left who remembered her at all, and shredded it in front of her. She hadn't cried, but her hands had shaken for days after. "You hear me?" he said, finally looking at her now. There was a challenge in his tone, a glimmer in his eye that sent a bolt of warning down her spine. "I'm not sneaking," she said. He smirked. "You better not be." She filled the glass from the tap, hands trembling slightly. Then she returned to her corner of the house, the smallest bedroom, where the wallpaper peeled and the window wouldn't open. It was still better than the nights she'd had to sleep in the barn because Jolene had needed the room for guests. She had never seen a single guest. Maribelle curled on her bed and stared at the cracked ceiling. She was 16 now, almost 17. Too old for this. Old enough to leave if she had somewhere to go. But she didn't. Not unless she counted the barn. That night, when the house had gone still and the cicadas hummed outside, she crept back to Dusty. She brought nothing but herself. No apple, no oats. Just her voice, soft and sad. "I wish I was someone else," she whispered into his mane. "Someone brave. Someone who could leave." Dusty shifted and pressed his forehead against hers. It was the only time she let herself cry. The next morning was different. Maribelle noticed it as soon as she entered the barn. Dusty wasn't in his usual stall. She froze. "Dusty?" No sound. The goats bleated, the chickens rustled, but the stallion was gone. Her heart beat faster. Then she heard hooves in the pasture. She ran through the side door, sprinting barefoot through the tall grass. And there he was, Dusty, trotting slow but proud, head high, mane glinting in the early light. Jolene was shouting from the porch, "That damn horse broke the fence, got into my garden." But Maribelle saw it immediately. The old boards were still intact. Someone had opened the latch, on purpose. And when she turned back toward the house, she caught the smirk on Clyde's face from behind the screen door. Dusty stood between her and the house now, like a wall of living muscle. Maribelle stepped forward. "Come on, boy, let's go back in." Dusty didn't move, and then Jolene stormed across the yard, face red with rage. "I said that horse is done. He's useless. He's costing more than he's worth. He's going to the auction this week." "No," Maribelle cried. "He's mine," Jolene snapped, "and I decide what happens to him." But Dusty, despite his age, stepped in front of Maribelle, head lowered, nostrils flaring. Jolene stopped cold. "What the—" The stallion took a step closer, a warning in every line of his body. "Get him back in the barn now," Jolene barked. Maribelle stared at the old horse. He wasn't just standing guard. He was choosing sides. And for the first time in her life, someone had chosen hers. She reached out and rested a hand on his flank. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm here." He didn't move until she did, and together they walked back to the barn. But that moment, when the stallion stepped between them, something shifted. Not just for her, for everyone. And it was only the beginning. That evening, Maribelle barely ate. Jolene had slammed her plate down so hard, half the mashed potatoes slid off the edge. Clyde slurped at his milk like a pig. No one spoke to her, and she didn't try to speak to them. She just counted the minutes until they'd forget about her presence altogether, until she could slip back outside. Dusty had been moved back to his stall, but his defiance still echoed through the house. Jolene had muttered about selling him all through dinner, threatening that he'd be gone by the weekend. Clyde had joked about turning him into glue. Maribelle excused herself as soon as she could. She slipped back into the barn just as the moon was rising, casting silver shadows across the floorboards. Dusty was awake, waiting. His ears perked the second she appeared. She closed the stall door behind her and leaned into him. His breath was steady, warm, and in that moment she could pretend the world beyond those wooden walls didn't exist. "I don't know what we're going to do," she whispered. "If they send you away—" She couldn't finish the thought, couldn't imagine this place without him. He nickered softly and nudged her arm with his nose. "I'll figure something out," she said. "I have to." But the truth was, she had no plan. She had no job, no money, and no license. She'd barely passed school because Jolene kept her home most days to do housework. Her only joy, her only solace, was here, in this barn with this horse. And come Sunday he would be gone. The next 2 days passed in a blur of worry. Jolene was in a foul mood, worse than usual. She muttered to herself constantly about feed prices and free-loading nags. Clyde found new ways to torment her, locking her out of the bathroom, hiding her socks, accusing her of sassing Jolene to get her punished. Maribelle stayed out of their way. She spent every free second in the barn, brushing Dusty's mane, oiling his hooves, whispering stories in his ear. "You ever want to run away too?" she asked him on Friday night. He blinked slowly, as if considering. "I think about it all the time," she admitted. "Just grabbing you and going, finding somewhere we both belong." She pressed her forehead to his shoulder. "But I don't even know where that is." Saturday morning, everything changed. She woke to shouting, male voices. She shot upright in bed, heart thudding. Outside, a rusted red trailer had backed into the driveway. A man in a flannel shirt and sweat-stained cap stood beside it, waving a clipboard. Jolene was yelling, pointing toward the barn. "No," Maribelle whispered. She scrambled into her jeans and sprinted out the back door barefoot. "Stop!" she screamed. "Don't take him!" Jolene whirled, face thunderous. "You stay out of this, girl. That horse is mine." "He's mine. And I say he's going to auction." The man looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I was just told to pick up—" "She lied!" Maribelle shouted. "She doesn't care about him. He's old, he's sick, he's all I have." Jolene stormed toward her, eyes flashing. "You shut your mouth!" But before she could reach her, a sound ripped through the air, a bellowing whinny, loud, fierce, angry. Dusty burst through the half-latched barn door like a storm. He thundered across the yard, hooves pounding, and he didn't slow down. He placed himself directly between Maribelle and Jolene, rearing slightly, letting out a second scream that shook the windows. The man with the trailer took a step back. "Whoa now!" "Get that beast under control," Jolene shrieked. But Dusty didn't move, not for her. He stood over Maribelle like a shield, eyes locked on Jolene, daring her to come closer. And Jolene, for once in her life, backed away. "You see that?" the man murmured, eyes wide. "That's not just some broken-down pony." "He's dangerous," Jolene hissed. "No," Maribelle said, her voice steadier than she thought possible. "He's defending me." Jolene's mouth opened, then shut. She looked between the horse and the girl. For a moment she looked afraid. "I'm not signing nothing if that horse acts like that," the man said, stepping away. "I ain't taking a liability." "You coward," Jolene spat. "Fine. Just go." He didn't have to be told twice. He got back in his truck and reversed out the driveway, fast. Dusty lowered his head to Maribelle, brushing his nose against her cheek like he was checking she was okay. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Thanks to you." She turned toward the house where Jolene had vanished inside. Maribelle followed. Dusty stayed at the barn entrance, watching. Inside, Jolene was pacing, furious. "You think this changes anything?" she barked. "That horse is gone by Monday. I don't care if I have to shoot him myself." Maribelle stood straighter than she ever had. "You lay a hand on him," she said, "and I'll call the sheriff." Jolene laughed bitterly. "You got no proof, no one to believe you." "You want to test that?" Maribelle's voice was like iron now. "Because if you do, I'll tell everything. About the beatings, the things Clyde says to me, the things you made me do when I was too little to say no." Jolene stopped laughing. "I'll tell it all," Maribel said. "And you know I'm not lying." There was a moment of silence so loud it felt like thunder. Jolene turned away, her hands shaking. "You wouldn't dare." "I already dared," Maribel whispered, "when I stepped between you and him, just like he stepped between you and me." She didn't wait for a reply. She walked out the front door and back toward the barn. Dusty was waiting, and from that day forward everything began to shift. Not all at once. Clyde still threw insults, but less often. Jolene kept her distance. The threats stopped. And in the barn each morning, Maribel smiled a little more. Because the old stallion hadn't just saved her. He taught her how to stand. Summer melted into fall, and the mornings grew crisp. Maribel noticed the changes in the air before she saw them in the trees, the way the sky shifted to a deeper blue, the way the breath from Dusty's nostrils misted like steam when she slipped into the barn before dawn. The old stallion moved slower these days, but there was still pride in every step he took. She groomed him daily, whispering dreams into his coat like prayers, dreams of leaving, of building something new, something safe. And for once they didn't feel foolish. Jolene had stopped talking about the auction altogether, but not because she'd softened. No, the fear Maribel had seen in her stepmother's eyes that morning, the morning Dusty stood between them, had lingered. Not fear of the horse, necessarily, but fear of being exposed. Maribel's threats had been real, and Jolene knew it. She might have ruled this house with a bitter tongue and a sharp hand, but all tyrants had one thing in common. They needed silence. And Maribel had finally broken hers. Clyde had mostly backed off too, though he still muttered beneath his breath when she passed. But something in the balance of power had changed. She was no longer the ghost that haunted their hallway, too afraid to look up or speak out. Dusty had given her more than protection. He'd given her courage. Still, things weren't perfect. Far from it. One evening Maribel returned from the barn to find Clyde standing outside her bedroom, his hand on the doorknob. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice steady. He looked at her with that same sneer he always wore, but this time it twitched. Just slightly. "Just making sure you're not hiding any more apples for your ugly horse." "I don't have to hide anything anymore." "That so?" he asked, taking a step toward her. "You think you're in charge now 'cause your crusty old pet reared up once?" She didn't move. "I think you should leave." He scoffed, but he did. And the next day, Dusty found a carrot hidden in his hay, small, but sweet. Maribel never found out who had left it, but something told her Clyde had a little more guilt in him than he let on. Weeks passed. The farm didn't magically improve, but the weight on her chest grew lighter. She started volunteering at the feed store 2 towns over, sweeping floors and organizing sacks for spare change. Mr. Firth, the owner, was a quiet man with kind eyes who never asked too many questions. But he paid her in feed sometimes, and that was enough. One afternoon, as she was loading a small bag of oats into the back of Mr. Firth's truck, he asked, "That old gray stallion still kickin'?" She smiled. "Very much so." "Heard he's got more fire in him than most geldings half his age." "He saved my life," she said before she could stop herself. Mr. Firth paused, studying her. "Horses'll do that, when they know you need savin'." He reached into the truck bed and pulled out an extra sack. "Take this one, too." "I didn't earn that one," she said. "Maybe not, but I reckon he did." She wiped at her eyes before they could spill over. By November, Dusty started slowing down even more. His joints ached in the mornings, and sometimes his knees buckled a little when he stood too long. But his spirit never faltered. He greeted her with a snort every morning, his head low but his eyes bright. She knew it couldn't last forever. But knowing and being ready were 2 different things. One chilly night, a storm rolled in from the west. The rain came first, slapping against the windows, then wind that howled like something ancient. Maribel couldn't sleep, not with the storm screaming outside and the barn so far from the house. She threw on her boots and jacket and darted outside with a flashlight in hand. The wind nearly took the door from its hinges when she yanked it open. Dusty was still in his stall, ears flicking at the sound of her approach. "I had to check on you," she said, breathless. "I couldn't sleep." He blinked slowly and stepped forward to rest his head on her shoulder. She wrapped her arms around his thick neck and held on. "I don't know what I'll do when you're gone," she whispered. The storm rattled the barn roof, but Dusty didn't flinch. He was still strong, still hers. In December, her Aunt Maggie showed up unannounced. Maribel hadn't seen her in almost 4 years, not since Jolene had stopped letting her send letters. The woman stood on the porch in a heavy coat, her expression lined with worry. Jolene looked like she'd swallowed glass when she opened the door and saw her. "I came to see my niece," Maggie said, voice firm. "She don't need visitors," Jolene replied. I wasn't asking." Maribel hadn't cried like that in a long time, not from fear or sadness, but from the flood of relief that came with being seen again. Maggie didn't stay long, just long enough to see the bruises that hadn't quite faded from Maribel's arms, to hear the tightness in her voice when she said everything was fine. The next week, a social worker showed up, then a sheriff, then paperwork. It took almost a month, but by mid-January it was official. Maggie had filed for custody. "I'm almost 17, Maribel told her. "I'm not a kid anymore." "You're still mine," Maggie said, "and I never stopped looking." The hardest part wasn't leaving Jolene behind. It was Dusty. "They won't let me bring him," Maribel told Maggie. "He's not mine, technically, and he's old. They said he should be put down." "Over my dead body," Maggie said. She made calls. She talked to friends. And in the end, she found a place. An old friend with a pasture and a barn and no expectations. "You really want him?" the friend had asked. "I owe him everything," Maribel said. The morning they loaded Dusty into the trailer, Maribel stood beside him the whole time. He walked in slow but willing, as if he trusted her completely, and he did. Because she was no longer the girl with no one to defend her. She had become the defender. And the old stallion, he had done more than just stand between her and cruelty. He had made her brave enough to do the same, for herself, forever. Maribel never forgot the way Dusty looked at her that first morning in the new pasture. The trailer door creaked open, and the soft sunlight spilled onto the bed of hay beneath his hooves. He hesitated only for a moment before stepping out onto unfamiliar ground, his head turning slowly, nostrils flaring. The breeze carried the scent of pine trees and damp earth, so different from the dry dust and cracked soil of Jolene's farm. "Easy now," Maribel murmured, her hand on his withers. He stood still for a while, just taking it all in, and then, without warning, he gave a low, rumbling nicker, half greeting, half question. "This is home now," she whispered, barely daring to believe it. The property wasn't large, but it was paradise compared to what they'd left behind. Aunt Maggie's friend, Lorraine, had converted her father's old land into a retirement pasture for horses that had outlived their owners or usefulness. But here, usefulness wasn't a requirement for worth. "He can stay as long as he wants," Lorraine had told her. "He earned it." The barn was weathered but clean. The pasture rolled out in a gentle slope toward a pond rimmed with cattails. Dusty took a few slow steps, stiff but proud, and dipped his head to graze. Maribel stood there a long time just watching. Later, she unpacked her meager belongings in Maggie's guest room. The bed was soft, the window opened easily, and the scent of cinnamon drifted through the house. It was the first time in years she had a door she could close without fearing someone would barge through it screaming. The next morning, she woke to birdsong instead of shouting. Her muscles ached from all the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. She made a habit of rising early, just like she had back at the old farm, only now the steps to the barn were no longer dreaded. Dusty would be waiting by the fence, ears forward, eyes bright. The other horses were younger, quicker, and full of fire, but Dusty didn't need to prove anything. He was the elder, the one with stories behind his eyes. Sometimes Maribel would sit beside him in the grass, reading aloud from library books or sketching in the battered notebook Aunt Maggie had given her. "I signed you up for school," Maggie said one evening over supper. "It's a little late in the year, but you'll catch up." "I don't need school," Maribel mumbled. "I'm almost done." "You'll finish, and you'll be proud of it," Maggie said, "and then you'll decide what's next, on your own terms." That phrase, "on your own terms," meant more than any diploma ever could. At school, the adjustment was rough. She wasn't used to being around people her age, much less ones who didn't flinch at the sound of a raised voice. But slowly, she found her footing. A girl named Ivy shared her lunch one day. A boy named Rafe offered to walk her home when it started to snow. They didn't pry, didn't ask about the haunted look that sometimes crossed her face. But Dusty knew. He always knew. On one particularly hard day, after a flashback was triggered in the middle of the class by the sound of a slammed locker, Maribel went straight to the pasture. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since that night in the barn, but she knelt down in the grass and laid her head against Dusty's flank. He shifted, just slightly, so she'd be more comfortable. "I feel broken sometimes," she whispered, "like I'll never be whole." Dusty huffed almost like a sigh. She looked up and he nudged her chin with his nose. "You're not broken. You're just healing." She could almost hear it in the way he looked at her. That spring, Dusty fell ill. It started small. He wasn't finishing his oats, moving slower than usual. Lorraine checked him every morning, assuring Maribel that age had its costs. But one morning, he didn't get up. They found him lying in the grass, head still up, eyes clear, but his legs wouldn't support him. The vet came quickly. Maribel didn't leave his side. "He's not in pain yet," the vet said, "but it's coming. The kindest thing may be to let him go." "No," Maribel said, "not yet, please. Just give me one more day." She spent that night lying beside him in the pasture, curled into his side beneath a blanket. The stars were brilliant above them, scattered like glitter against black velvet. She sang to him softly, songs her mother used to hum when she was little. She told him stories, thanked him for every moment, every time he stood between her and harm. "You gave me my voice back," she said, tears streaming into his coat. "You gave me a reason to believe I was worth protecting." His ear flicked weakly at the sound of her voice. She knew he heard her. The sun rose slowly. The world felt suspended in that quiet dawn. Dusty's breaths grew shallow. His great chest, once so strong, moved less and less. Maribel laid a kiss between his eyes. "You can rest now," she whispered. "You kept me safe. I'll keep going. I promise." He passed just after sunrise, with her arms wrapped around his neck. They buried him beneath the tall oak at the far end of the field, where the wildflowers grew thick in spring. Maribel carved a small plaque with his name and the words, "He stood for me when no one else would." In the years that followed, she kept that promise. She graduated high school with honors. She started working at Lorraine's pasture full-time, helping train rescue horses. Eventually, she applied to veterinary school. Every horse she cared for, she did it with the same tenderness that Dusty had shown her. Every frightened animal, every skittish colt, every neglected mare. She approached them with patience, understanding, and a quiet strength, because she knew what it meant to be broken, and she knew what it meant to be healed. One spring, years later, she stood beneath the oak with a new little girl at her side, a girl whose foster file had landed on her desk by accident, a girl with dark circles under her eyes and fists that stayed clenched, even in sleep. Maribel knelt beside her. "This is where a great horse is buried," she said. "He was brave and gentle and strong. He protected me when I couldn't protect myself." The girl said nothing, just stared at the plaque. "He taught me how to stand up for the people I love," Maribel said. "And now I'm going to teach you." The girl didn't speak, but she reached out and for the first time took Maribel's hand. Above them, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the rustling leaves, Maribel swore she could hear the echo of a whinny. Soft, sure, and proud. The seasons circled on, and with them Maribel grew. Time didn't erase what had been done to her, but it rewrote the script she once believed would always define her. She didn't have to be the quiet girl in the corner anymore, afraid of raised voices and slammed doors. She was the woman who had survived, who had been seen, who had been defended, and who now defended others. By the time she was 23, she'd earned her degree in animal care and therapy. Not a veterinarian exactly, schooling for that was long and expensive, but a certified equine therapist. Her small nonprofit, Dusty's Path, opened the following spring. It sat on a modest piece of land that Lorraine sold to her for next to nothing, with Aunt Maggie helping her co-sign the loan. It was everything she'd once dreamed of as a child. A barn filled with rescued animals, a pasture full of wildflowers, and a little wooden sign out front with a hand-carved horse rearing beneath an oak tree. She specialized in taking in both the damaged animals and the wounded children, foster kids, trauma survivors, teens who had been tossed from homes like junk mail. She didn't try to be their hero. She just gave them space, let the horses do the rest. One boy, Josiah, hadn't spoken in nearly 3 weeks when he came. He wouldn't touch the horses, wouldn't even look at them. Then one afternoon, he slipped into the barn alone. Maribel watched from a distance as he approached a speckled mare with a crooked leg and cloudy eye. "Hey," he whispered, stroking the horse's shoulder. "You look like me." Maribel turned away, eyes shining. That's all it took sometimes. Healing didn't need to come with fanfare or magic. It came in soft touches, in morning light, in patient creatures who asked nothing but presence. She kept Dusty's picture in her office. It was the only photograph she had, an old Polaroid from years ago, his mane tangled and his eye half closed, nuzzling her cheek. Clients often asked about him. "That your first horse?" they'd say. She'd smile. "He was my best horse, and my first real friend." She told his story sometimes, especially to the ones who thought they couldn't be saved. "You don't have to believe in yourself yet," she'd tell them. "Sometimes you just need someone else to believe in you first." Dusty had done that for her. One autumn morning, she got a letter. It was from Clyde. The envelope was plain, the handwriting rough. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Maribel, I don't expect you to read this, but I wanted to say something. You didn't deserve what we did to you. I don't know why I was like that. I think I was angry all the time and didn't know where to put it. So I put it on you. You were just a kid. I was old enough to know better. I'm sorry. I heard about the horse. I think he was the only decent thing in that place. I guess you were too. I hope you're happy. Clyde." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some ghosts faded all on their own. Later that day, she walked the pasture with the kids, telling them about Dusty. "How old was he when you met him?" one girl asked. "He was already old," Maribel replied, "but he was strong. He stood between me and a lot of things I couldn't face." "Wasn't he scared?" "I don't think so," she said. "Or maybe he was, but he did it anyway." And that, she told herself, was what real strength looked like. A month later, a mare gave birth in the back stall, a long-legged filly with the same pale gray coat Dusty once wore. Maribel watched her wobble onto her feet, heart aching with something fierce and joyful. The kids gathered around, awed. "What are you going to name her?" one asked. Maribel didn't hesitate. "Promise." Because that's what Dusty had been, a promise that love could protect, that someone could care even when the world turned cruel, that even in the darkness, someone might step forward and say, "Enough." Years passed and Dusty's Path thrived, not because of any fame or money, but because it mattered. One girl left behind a note after her last session. It said only, "You and that horse saved my life." Maribelle taped it above her desk, and every morning before the sun rose, she walked the pasture alone, just like she used to. The horses stirred around her, quiet and gentle in the light. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she just stood and listened. Once she swore she saw a gray shape in the mist near the oak tree. She smiled. "I'm okay now," she whispered, and the wind carried the words away like a secret shared only with him. The stallion who stood between her and the world, the one who taught her how to stand on her own. The winter that followed was the softest she could remember. Snow dusted the barn roof like powdered sugar, and the cold no longer felt like punishment. It was simply part of the rhythm now. The horses grew shaggy with thick coats, their breath steaming in the morning air. Maribelle took to carrying a thermos of tea into the pasture, sipping slowly as she checked on each of them. Promise, the filly born beneath the oak, was growing fast. She had Dusty's curious eyes, always watching, always learning. Her gait was clumsy, full of youth, but every now and then Maribelle saw a flicker of something deeper, a confidence that came from something beyond blood, legacy maybe, spirit. Whatever it was, it reminded her of the first time Dusty had placed himself between her and danger, not with rage, but with calm authority. She spent long hours with Promise, teaching her to trust, to yield, to lead. There was a gentleness in the process that soothed Maribel's own scars. She understood now that healing wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't something you checked off a list. It was a cycle, a choosing, a daily decision to live with grace in the face of all you had endured. One morning, as the snow began to melt, Aunt Maggie came by with boxes from the attic. "I was cleaning out some of the old things," she said, "and found these. Figured you might want to look through them." Inside was a mix of forgotten treasures, a photo of Maribelle as a baby, curled against her mother's chest, crayon drawings, a tattered composition notebook with her name scrawled across the front. She sat on the floor for hours, flipping through the pages. Stories she'd started as a child, dreams she'd written before life had taught her to be small. And there, tucked into the back cover, was a single page that made her breath catch. A drawing. Her standing beside a horse, hand on his cheek. Above them, in wobbly block letters, were the words, "He's my protector." It had to have been drawn before Dusty, before everything. And yet, somehow, it had foretold him. She hung it in her office. When spring returned in full bloom, so did the children. Word had spread about Dusty's path. Teachers referred kids from nearby schools. Social workers called weekly. There were too many names for the waiting list, not enough horses. But Maribelle never turned anyone away. If she couldn't offer a ride or a grooming lesson, she offered silence and a seat in the pasture. Sometimes that was all a child needed, space to breathe. Promise became a favorite, not just because of her color or her speed, but because she gravitated toward the quietest ones, the ones who sat alone, heads down, shoulders tight with old fear. She would walk over, gently nudge their backs, and wait, not asking, just present, just like Dusty used to be. That summer, the town fair held a special exhibition for local equine programs. Maribelle almost said no. She didn't believe in parading her horses around or turning trauma into showmanship. But a few of the older teens begged to go. "They need to see what this place does," Ivy said. "What you did." So they went. Promise was the youngest horse in the ring. Her coat gleamed silver in the sun. Maribelle walked beside her, hand steady on the lead, while 3 students rode behind on their own rescues. The crowd clapped politely, unaware of the weight behind every step. But one man approached after the show, his eyes glassy. "My daughter," he said, nodding toward a girl in a wheelchair. "She hasn't spoken in a year, but when your filly walked by, she smiled." Maribelle didn't have to ask why. Some things didn't need explanation. The next few years passed like pages in a storybook, not without challenge, but full of growth, full of grace. Dusty's memory became a guiding star, not a shadow. Maribelle still visited his grave beneath the oak each week. She'd sit in the grass, watching the light play through the leaves, and speak aloud as if he were still listening. Maybe he was. Then, one crisp morning, Maribelle found a letter in the mailbox. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Jolene. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The paper was cheap, the words sparse. Maribelle, I know I don't deserve anything from you. I've been sick. Thinking too much. I saw your name in the paper. Something about horses. About healing. I just wanted to say, I don't know how you turned out kind, but I'm glad you did. I'm sorry. For all of it. Jolene. She read it twice, then again. She didn't cry. She didn't feel triumph. Only a hollow ache, like the echo of a wound long since closed. She didn't write back. But that night, when she sat beneath the oak, she whispered, Even she saw you. The breeze stirred the grass. One winter night, years later, Maribelle woke with a start, not from fear, but from a dream. She had been a child again, in the barn, and Dusty had stepped between her and something dark. But this time she wasn't crying. She was smiling. And he had looked at her, not with pity, not with concern, but with pride. When she looked into the mirror that morning, she saw it too. Strength. She'd earned every inch of it. And so, when she rode Promise that day, no saddle, no reins, just trust between them, she laughed, not politely, not softly. She laughed full and wild and free. Because once she had been a girl with no one to defend her. And now she defended the world, all because one old stallion had stood his ground and given her the strength to rise. Years passed and the world changed around her, but the oak tree never did. It stood tall in the center of the pasture, the final resting place of the horse who had saved her life. Children came and went. Some stayed longer than others. Some returned years later with their own children in tow, smiling shyly, asking if the old tree was still there, if the barn still smelled the same, if the horses still remembered them. Maribelle would always say yes, because some things, some places, some spirits never leave. Promise matured into a strong, steady mare with a sharp mind and a patient soul. She took over Dusty's legacy as if born to it, quietly tending to those who arrived in silence and left with fire in their eyes. One boy, Mateo, arrived after running away from his fourth foster home. He didn't speak for weeks, not even to the social worker, but Promise stood with him in the field one rainy afternoon as he screamed into the wind. She didn't flinch, didn't bolt, just stood there and took it, like Dusty once had for Maribelle, until he dropped to his knees, empty and sobbing, and pressed his face into her side. That was the first day he let anyone touch him. Each child became a story, and Maribelle remembered them all. They filled her journals, pages worn and ink smudged. She wrote not only what they did, but who they were. Each spark of life they rediscovered. In every note, Dusty's name appeared like a watermark. He was in all of it, every saved life, every open heart, every victory. The local paper caught wind of her work and published a feature. They called her the girl who healed with horses. The article went viral. Donors started reaching out. Therapists called to collaborate. Universities asked her to speak. She accepted only a few offers. Fame had never interested her. It was the children who mattered. The bruised and quiet, the sharp-tongued and scared, the ones who trembled when someone raised their voice but held fast when a horse nuzzled their hand. She built more stables, hired 2 more staff. Aunt Maggie retired and moved into the house on the property, baking pies and telling stories and loving everyone like they were blood. One spring, Maribelle hosted a reunion. Dozens of former students came, some now grown, some still finding their way. They brought gifts, photos, poems, letters. But the greatest gift was when Josiah, now 20, stepped forward with a sleek golden rosette in hand. "I've been working with therapy animals for a couple years now," he said, voice thick with emotion. "And this is from my first regional win. I couldn't have done it without you, or him." He handed her the ribbon and nodded toward the oak. They held a moment of silence that day. Beneath the tree, no speeches, no ceremony. Just hands pressed to bark, eyes closed, a hush broken only by the wind. The youngest girl there, barely 6, looked up at Maribel and whispered, "Do you think he still watches us?" Maribel bent down beside her. "I don't think he ever stopped." That night, after everyone had gone and the barn lights had dimmed, she sat alone beneath the stars. The fields glowed faintly in moonlight, and promise grazed nearby. She thought of who she had once been, the girl in the cracked mirror, the one afraid to speak, the one who trembled at footsteps and didn't know how to ask for kindness. And then she thought of Dusty, the old stallion, the wall between her and cruelty, the shield and the strength. The quiet guardian who had stepped forward not because he had to, but because he saw something in her worth saving. "I'm still trying to be the person you saw," she whispered into the dark. "Every day." The wind lifted, the grass danced, and for a fleeting second she could swear she heard hooves in the distance. She closed her eyes and smiled, because once upon a time there was a girl who had no one to defend her, and a horse who refused to let that stand, and now, because of him. There was a whole world she had built, one child, one horse, one story at a time, where no one would ever stand alone again. And still the story kept unfolding, not in chapters or dramatic turns, but in slow, steady moments stitched together with love, grit, and grace. Each morning Maribel rose with the sun, not because she had to, but because she wanted to be there for the stillness before the world woke up. The frost on the barn door handle, the steam rising from the horses' backs, the moment of first eye contact with Promise, who always met her at the gate, as if to say, "We've got another day, don't we?" They always did, and they made it count. She started taking in more horses. Some were skittish, abused. Others were simply abandoned, no longer profitable, no longer young. Maribel welcomed them all. She didn't see misfits or brokenness. She saw survivors, fighters, souls who hadn't given up even when the world had. Her team grew, former students, volunteers, trainers. Each brought their own fire to the work. Ivy came back after college and asked to stay on. Josiah returned to run the youth mentorship program. Even Rafe, that sweet boy from high school, had found his way into her life again. They'd kept in touch, off and on, until one day he'd asked, gently, "Do you think there's room for someone who's never ridden a horse, but wants to learn how to carry someone else's weight?" She'd said yes. And over time they built a life together, quiet, solid, full of little joys. He never asked her for more than she could give. He never raised his voice, never questioned why she woke up gasping from dreams some nights. He simply held her hand and listened, and she loved him for that. The barn got a fresh coat of paint. The pasture fences were reinforced. Aunt Maggie's pies became legendary. Kids came early just for a slice. The nonprofit expanded to offer after-school programs, grief counseling, and even equine-assisted therapy for veterans. Dusty's legacy was growing, even though his name was only spoken in quiet reverence now, a thread running through everything but never demanding center stage. Then one fall, an unexpected package arrived. Inside was a leather-bound journal, no return address, no note, just a cover embossed with her name. Inside were photos, snapshots she hadn't seen in years, some taken from a distance as if by someone too afraid to approach. Her brushing Dusty's mane, feeding him an apple, crying into his shoulder, and on the final page in shaky handwriting, "I watched what I tried to break become whole. It was from Clyde. She knew it instinctively. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Forgiveness wasn't easy. But sometimes life didn't ask you to forgive for their sake. It asked you to forgive for your own. So you could keep building, so you could breathe. She placed the journal on her bookshelf between Dusty's photo and the ribbon Josiah had given her, and then she went outside. The wind was cool, leaves drifting down like confetti. Promise galloped freely with two younger rescues beside her, protective, maternal, fierce. Maribelle stood by the oak for a long while. It was weathered now, branches a little thinner, bark starting to split. But still it stood. Still it watched. Still it remembered. She placed her hand against the trunk and whispered, "I did it. I'm doing it." Behind her the kids called her name. "Miss Maribelle, come see. Miss Maribelle." She let me ride without holding the horn. "Miss Maribelle, I think he smiled at me." She turned. She smiled. And she ran to meet them, because this was her life now, not marked by what she'd endured, but by what she'd created in its wake. A world where safety wasn't a privilege, it was a promise. A place where frightened girls became fierce women, where abandoned things were cherished, where the weak weren't discarded but honored, and where, long ago, an old stallion had taken one slow step between cruelty and a girl with shaking hands, and changed everything, forever. The first real book about Dusty came out the following spring. It wasn't Maribelle who wrote it, not officially, but one of her former students, now a published author, had begged her for permission to tell the story. She agreed, but only on one condition: tell the truth. Don't dress it up. Don't make me the hero. Make him the hero. And he did. The book was called The One Who Stepped Between. It opened with a single image. A girl, 15 years old, hiding in a barn with an old gray stallion standing guard. The pages that followed told the story almost exactly as it happened. Except now, Dusty's name was known around the world. People wrote letters, thousands of them, from foster children in Ireland, from women who had escaped abusive homes, from veterans, from nurses, from horse lovers, from people who'd never even seen a barn but swore they understood what it meant to be held in the quiet strength of someone who expected nothing in return. Maribelle read every single one. She kept them in a trunk at the foot of her bed, beside the journal Clyde had sent. Some nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the horses shifted in their stalls, she'd read a few lines to herself and remember. This was why Dusty mattered. Because his act, the simple act of stepping between her and a world that wanted her silent, had rippled outward into places he'd never lived long enough to see. And now he was everywhere. Promise gave birth that year, her first foal. A colt, lean and lanky, with a white star on his brow. Maribelle named him Banner, because he carried Dusty's legacy like a flag. He was bold and stubborn and smart, but gentle too, always watching, always listening. It took time, but when he was old enough, Banner was the first to work with a boy named Tyler, a foster child who didn't speak at all for the first month he was there. Tyler had been through things no child should endure. The scars on his arms were only part of the story. But Banner didn't care. He walked beside Tyler through every moment of silence, until one day Tyler placed his hand on the colt's back and whispered, "Thank you." Just like that, the healing began. Maribelle watched it happen, and as always felt Dusty there, not as a memory, not even as a ghost, but as presence, as purpose. By the time she turned 35, Dusty's path had grown into a full-scale center, offering equine therapy, mental health counseling, vocational training, and a summer camp for kids who needed somewhere to feel safe. A place that had once been just a barn and a girl who barely had a voice was now home to over 30 horses, 5 counselors, 2 therapists, a youth mentorship coordinator, and a dozen volunteers who lived to see the kids and animals grow together. They kept Dusty's old halter in a glass case in the main barn. Above it was a sign that read, "It only takes one act of courage to change a life." Visitors often asked who Dusty was. Maribelle would smile and point to the oak at the top of the hill. "You'll feel him before you see him," she'd say. "He's still there." In truth, she felt him in everything. In the sound of hooves on packed earth, in the first quiet smile of a child who hadn't smiled in months, in the smell of fresh hay and warm coats and pine trees, in the softness of a foal's muzzle pressed into a trembling hand. She felt him in herself, too, in the way she no longer flinched at loud voices, no longer folded in on herself when the past whispered lies. She felt him every time she stood tall, every time she said no, every time she said yes, and meant it with her whole heart. Maribelle knew her work would never be done. There would always be more pain to mend, more kids to protect, more horses to save. But she also knew she wouldn't have to do it alone, because Dusty had taught her the greatest truth of all, that sometimes love doesn't come in grand gestures or perfect people. Sometimes it arrives in the shape of an old, battered stallion who refuses to let you fall. And when love stands beside you like that, you rise, and you rise, and you rise. And so Maribelle kept rising. Years drifted by like morning mist across the pasture, quiet and golden and full of meaning. She aged gracefully, though she barely noticed. She stayed busy. There was always a child arriving with pain in their eyes, always a horse that needed gentling, healing, a second chance. She gave what she had, not out of obligation, but because giving had become as natural as breathing. She didn't keep track of how many lives Dusty's path had touched. She only kept track of the ones who stayed. Like Ivy, who now ran the intake center. Like Mateo, who managed the stables and taught weekend riding clinics. Like Josiah, who had opened a similar sanctuary downstate and brought his own group of kids up every summer to visit the tree. They came and they stayed. Because what Maribelle had built wasn't just a program. It was a family. And Dusty was still the heartbeat. One quiet spring morning, she walked the pasture alone. It had become a ritual before the sun fully crested, before the chores began. She'd slip out the back porch in her boots, mug in hand, and just walk. Promise often shadowed her, and now Banner too, grown and noble, head high, ears flicking, at the soft rustle of life all around. She passed the oak like she always did and paused beneath its towering limbs. For a moment she closed her eyes. And there he was, not in body, not even in memory, but in presence, felt more than seen. "I'm still going," she whispered, "and I'm not done yet." A warm breeze brushed her face, gentle as a nuzzle. That day, a girl named Hallie arrived, 10 years old, thin as paper, hollow-eyed, scared of everything and everyone. They didn't push her, they never did. But by the third day, she was feeding carrots through the fence. By the 6th, she was leading Promise on a walk. By the 10th, she was laughing. Maribelle didn't rush it, she never did. But one night, as they stood by the oak after sunset, Hallie asked in a soft voice, "Is it true you used to be like me?" Maribelle nodded. "I still am sometimes." "What happened?" Hallie asked. Maribelle looked up at the branches. The moonlight filtered through the leaves like silver. "I met someone who stood between me and the bad, just once, and it changed everything." Hallie was quiet. Then, "Where is he now?" Maribelle pointed to the ground beneath their feet. "Right here?" The child knelt down and placed her hand gently on the soil. And for the first time since she arrived, she smiled without fear. That night Maribelle wept, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of love. How it endured, how it grew, how it planted roots so deep they bore fruit long after the tree was gone. She stayed under the oak until the stars were sharp in the sky, until the past and present blurred into one. She sat with everything, the pain, the beauty, the quiet triumph of survival. And when she finally stood to go, she looked back once more. "I'll never stop telling them," she said into the dark, "what you did, what you gave me." And as the wind rustled through the leaves, as the branches shifted against the sky, she heard it. Not words, but an answer, a presence, a promise. Still here, still watching, still standing. And in that final stretch of quiet, as the years folded softly into one another, Maribel understood what legacy truly meant. It wasn't the buildings, it wasn't the headlines or the plaques, or the recognition that had come in drizzles over time. It wasn't even the countless letters she received from kids now grown, living lives once thought impossible, free from fear, full of hope. Legacy was this: a hand reaching out because once a horse reached for her, a heart softening because once hers had been shattered and pieced back together by something wordless and warm. A life rebuilt, not because someone gave her a better one, but because someone gave her the courage to build her own. One summer, when she was nearly 60, Maribel stood once more beneath the old oak, her hair silver now, her body slower but still strong. Beside her stood Promise, older too, her coat speckled with the pale signs of time. And at Promise's flank stood Banner's daughter, barely old enough to be weaned, curious and wide-eyed, nosing at Maribel's worn hands. 3 generations. And behind them, laughter rang out, children running between paddocks, teenagers helping little ones onto saddles, horses nickering softly as the barn doors swung open in the morning light. This was what Dusty had made possible. With one act of defiance, one moment of clarity, one step forward between a girl and her pain. Maribel dropped to her knees beside the tree and placed both palms against the ground. She didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. Her whole body was a thank you. She stayed that way for a long time until the shadows shifted and the sun warmed her shoulders. That evening, as the lanterns were lit and the horses fed, she took her journal, the final volume, and began to write. Not about trauma, not even about healing, but about becoming. Becoming someone who knows her worth. Becoming someone who protects, not because she must, but because it's who she is. Becoming the girl who once trembled in silence, and became the woman who taught others how to speak. Her last sentence, penned slowly and carefully, was this: "He stood between me and the darkness, and left behind a light that never went out." She closed the journal and placed it on the shelf with the others. Then she stepped out into the twilight, where the horses waited, where a girl's spirit still walked beside her. And in the hush of dusk, with the grass whispering underfoot and the wind curling softly through the trees, Maribel smiled. Because the girl who had no one to defend her had become the woman who made sure no one ever stood alone again. And Dusty, he still stood with her, always. Maribel's knees ached more now when she crouched to tie feed buckets or pull weeds along the barn path, but she welcomed the ache. It meant she was still doing the work, still moving, still needed. Dusty's path had grown far beyond what she imagined when she first fled Jolene's farm. There was a second barn now, nicknamed the West Wing by the kids, dedicated solely to horses rescued from cruelty cases. The local sheriff's office even called her personally now when they needed someone to take a confiscated animal. She always said yes, even when it hurt, even when she knew what kind of nightmares those horses carried. One of the newest arrivals was a stallion named Flint, black as coal, with a deep scar under one eye and hooves so cracked she wept the first time she saw them. He bit, kicked, panicked at every sudden sound. Most would have written him off as dangerous, but Maribel saw something different. "Come on," she murmured to him on the third day, standing just outside the stall, a quiet bucket of grain in hand. "I've known another stallion like you." Flint didn't move, but he didn't strike either. She came back every day. No sudden movements, no expectations, just presence. Eventually, He let her touch his neck, then his muzzle, then, finally, his back. "He reminds me of Dusty," she told Ivy one afternoon, running her fingers gently over Flint's rib cage as she groomed him. "Not in how he behaves, but in how hard he's trying not to break." Flint became her new project, not to tame, but to trust. And slowly, painfully, he did. One afternoon in the pasture, a boy named Kieran dropped to the ground during a therapy session. Panic attack. Couldn't breathe. The other horses scattered, but Flint, wild, damaged Flint, walked over to him, slowly, carefully, and stood beside him. Didn't nudge, didn't move, just stood there. Kieran reached out blindly, his hand landing on Flint's hoof, his breathing slowed. That night, Maribelle knelt in the grass beneath the oak again. "I see you in him," she whispered, "every day." And the wind whispered back through the branches. That fall, they held the first Dusty's Day, a celebration of rescues, recoveries, and reminders. Former students returned with families of their own, the barnyard filled with laughter, food, and memories. There was a wall now inside the original barn, photos of every horse who'd ever passed through the gates. Dusty's portrait was framed at the center, surrounded by faded halters, first hoof trimmings, and paper hearts with handwritten notes. Children walked the rows pointing to the names. "That one helped me stop cutting. That one was the first living thing I trusted. I was going to give up. Then she let me ride." Maribelle stood back and watched it all unfold. One girl, maybe 10, approached her with a nervous shuffle. "Is it okay if I add something to the wall?" Maribelle knelt to her level. "Of course, what is it?" The girl held out a folded piece of paper. On it was a crayon drawing, herself, arms wrapped around a gray horse with kind eyes. Above them, in pink scribble, were the words, "He stood between me and the dark." Maribelle blinked hard. "May I ask what his name is?" she said softly. The girl smiled. "Flint." She taped the drawing to the wall with shaking hands. That night she didn't cry. She simply lay in bed, her hands clasped over her chest, and let the silence of the house wrap around her like a quilt. The world outside was full of chaos, yes, but not here. Here there was safety. Here there was memory. Here there was peace. And Dusty? Dusty was in every breath of it. The first winter storm rolled in thick and early that year. The hills outside Dusty's path lay blanketed in white, and the barn roofs groaned under the weight of snow. Horses huddled closer in their stalls. The heaters ran all night. Maribelle spent more time wrapped in thick scarves and heavier coats, but she never once considered staying inside when the pasture called. There was a new girl on the grounds, Lainey. She was 13 and angry at the world, with cropped hair, ripped jeans, and a silence sharper than broken glass. Her parents had overdosed months apart, and she'd bounced between homes until the system finally gave up trying to place her long-term. When she first arrived, she refused to go near the horses, sat cross-legged by the barn doors, and stared at the gravel. "I don't need this farm therapy crap," she muttered when Maribelle brought her cocoa. "Horses are just big dumb animals." Maribelle didn't argue. She just nodded. "That's okay. They're here anyway." For 3 days, Lainey didn't speak again. Then, one afternoon, as snow fell in heavy flakes, she stepped inside and watched Flint from across the barn. The scarred stallion watched her too, unmoving, breath clouding from his nostrils. "I know what that kind of scar means," Lainey whispered. "Somebody did that on purpose." Maribelle said nothing. The next day, Lainey returned with a brush. Didn't ask permission, just stepped in. Flint let her touch him without flinching. "I get you," she said under her breath. 2 weeks later, Lainey was smiling. Not often, not big, but real. And Maribelle wrote about it in her journal that night, finishing with, "Another girl, another ghost turned whole. Thank you, Dusty, for every door you opened long after you were gone." In early spring, The pasture thawed. The kids helped reseed the fields, fill troughs, repaint fences. Laughter became normal again. One evening just after dusk, Maribelle stood with Ivy by the fence line, watching the sunset wash the trees in honey light. "You ever think about retirement?" Ivy asked gently. Maribelle smiled. "This is retirement. You know what I mean." She nodded, brushing her fingers along a post. "I won't always be able to run the day-to-day," she admitted, "but I'll always be here, even when I'm not." "How so?" She looked toward the barn where kids were feeding, brushing, laughing. "Because I was never the magic," Maribelle said. "Dusty was, and he gave it to them." She turned 70 quietly. No party, no big fuss. But Ivy and Mateo planned something better. At the edge of the property, near the backwoods, they unveiled a statue. It was life-size. Dusty. Head high, tail curling in mid-step, one hoof forward, carved from dark stone and positioned so that he faced the road, like a sentry. At the base, an inscription: "To the one who stood between, to the girl who stood because of him, to everyone learning how to rise." Maribelle wept when she saw it. It was more than she'd ever imagined, more than she felt she deserved. But the children had insisted. The team had insisted. Because the story wasn't just about Dusty anymore. It was about her. She walked slower now. Her bones ached in the mornings. Her fingers were stiffer, her knees less sure, but she still made the rounds. She still sat beside each horse when they needed gentling. She still told bedtime stories in the hayloft when the wind howled outside and the youngest kids were afraid. And every time she walked beneath the oak, she paused. Sometimes she'd whisper a name, a prayer, a thank you. One evening, under a sky burning gold, she sat at Dusty's grave and closed her eyes. "I'll go soon," she murmured. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. And when I do, I'll be ready." The wind stirred, the trees' branches danced, and she smiled. Maribelle passed away on a quiet morning in early summer. She was found in the pasture, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, leaning against Promise's shoulder with her eyes peacefully closed. There was no pain, no drama, just stillness, just peace. The entire community turned up for the service. Former students, dozens of them, came from across the country. Some brought their children, others brought photos. One man knelt beside the oak and placed a ribbon at its base. Another whispered a prayer in Spanish. They buried her beside Dusty, just as she had requested. And in place of a headstone, they planted a second oak. The children called it Maribelle's Tree. Years later, when visitors walked the pasture, new guides would tell them, "She was the girl who had no one to defend her." But an old stallion stepped forward, and she spent the rest of her life making sure no one stood alone again. And beneath those twin trees, one old, one new, people would often leave notes. Tiny scraps of paper, folded drawings, pieces of string, photos. One note in a child's handwriting summed it up best. "Thank you for standing for her. She stood for me." The wind swept harder that night. Maribelle lay awake in her modest cottage, listening to the creaks of the old beams above her and the whistle of the breeze as it curled around the house. Outside, the barn sat quiet, the horses tucked into their stalls, the pasture dark. But she felt something old and familiar. She sat up, swung her legs over the edge of the bed, and reached for the wool shawl that had once belonged to Aunt Maggie. She lit a small lantern, not because she needed to see, but because light still made her feel safe. Outside, the night was cold but clear. Stars blinked down at her like old friends. The oak stood tall at the far edge of the property, barely visible in the moonlight. And still she walked to it. No one else stirred, just her and the wind. She knelt by the grave as she had hundreds of times before and let her palm rest on the stone marker there. The stone was smooth, worn by time and weather, the lettering beginning to fade. Dusty, the one who stood. She closed her eyes. I still remember the sound your hooves made when you stepped between me and her, she whispered. It was the first time anything stood up for me. The tree swayed. She could hear the rustle of leaves above her, like someone listening. You were old, broken down. Everyone said you were finished, she said. But you weren't. She looked up at the stars, voice cracking. You were just waiting for me? A tear slipped down her cheek. Then she heard it. Not with her ears, no, with something else. Something older, deeper. A slow exhale, a snort, a hoof shifting in the soil beside her. She turned quickly, heart in her throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the quiet of the pasture. But she smiled anyway, because she knew he was there. That spring, Dusty's Path opened a new program called The First Step, designed for girls just like Maribelle had been. Girls who came from nothing, who had no voice, no place to go. Many were runaways. Some were barely 12. Some had babies of their own. And the horses, they didn't ask questions. They never did. They just waited. One of them, an old bay gelding named Bishop, was as near to Dusty's spirit as anything she'd seen in decades. Bishop had been rescued from a trailer abandoned on a forest road. The animal shelter said he'd been locked in there for days before someone reported the smell. But when they pulled him out, he didn't bite, didn't bolt, just stood there, quiet, hollow-eyed. The first girl he bonded with was named Trinity, 15, burned out, tattooed even though she wasn't old enough, angry at everything. She refused to speak to the staff. But on her second night, she wandered into the barn, sat in the straw, and stared at Bishop's stall. You get it, don't you, she said. Bishop didn't move. I didn't ask for any of it, didn't deserve it. Still, he stood there. Trinity got up, opened the stall, and walked in. The next morning, Maribelle found her curled up beside the old gelding, fast asleep. She didn't wake her. Instead, she stood in the doorway, heart swelling, and whispered, "Thank you." The years rolled on, but Maribelle remained a fixture on the land. Her hair thinned, her knees stiffened, her fingers bent in the cold. But she was still the first one up when a new horse arrived, still the first to greet a crying child, still the one who told them, "I was you once, and I didn't think I'd make it either." One evening, Rafe brought her tea on the porch. They'd grown old together, never rushed, never labeled, but steady, dependable, like rain after drought. "You ever think he's watching?" Rafe asked. She looked toward the oak. "I know he is." "Sometimes I swear I hear him in the barn," Rafe chuckled. She smiled. "He never left." When the time finally came, when her body grew too tired to wake before dawn, when the walks to the barn became shorter, she made arrangements. Dusty's Path would pass into Ivy's hands. Josiah would help with the financials. Mateo would manage the horses. Trinity, now in her 20s, would take over the First Step program. And Promise? Promise would be buried beside Dusty when her time came, under that oak, now taller than it had ever been. Maribelle wrote letters to each person, not long ones, just enough. To Ivy, "You were my first proof that healing spreads." To Mateo, "You brought discipline to chaos. Keep loving gently." To Trinity, "You are why I stayed. You're proof of why we start again." To Rafe, "Thank you for never trying to fix me, just for walking beside me." And to Dusty, the only letter she didn't leave behind but folded and tucked under a stone at the foot of the tree, "You were never just a horse. You were the moment my life turned. You were the line between my end and my beginning. I hope I made you proud. I never stopped standing because you showed me how." She placed her hand on the stone one last time and breathed, "I'm ready." That night, in her sleep, the dream returned. The barn, the cold, her younger self curled on the straw. But this time the door opened and Dusty stepped in. Whole, radiant, strong. He bent his head and she reached up. And together they walked out of the barn, not into darkness, but into light.